Imagine this. You're a horse thief in 1870s Montana, caught red-handed with stolen livestock. The nearest courthouse is 200 miles away, winter is approaching, and the mining camp you're in has no jail. What happens next isn't a fair trial. It's frontier justice, swift and brutal, carried out by men who believe the harshness of the land demands equally harsh consequences. The American frontier operated under its own code of justice, where survival often trumped legal procedure and punishment served as both retribution and deterrent. In territories where law enforcement was scarce and courts were distant, communities took justice into their own hands with methods that would shock modern sensibilities. From vigilante committees conducting mass hangings to branding human flesh like cattle, these are the most horrifying punishment methods used in the Wild West, starting with lynching. Death by rope became the most efficient form of frontier justice across the American West. When communities faced threats to their survival and property, they turned to the oldest form of crowd punishment known to civilization. The simplicity was brutal in its effectiveness. A rope, a tree, and enough angry men to carry out the sentence. Vigilance committees emerged as unofficial governing bodies in territories where official law enforcement remained absent or corrupt. These groups operated under the belief that swift justice prevented chaos from consuming their fragile communities. San Francisco's Committee of Vigilance demonstrated this philosophy in 1856, when over 8,000 armed citizens took control of the city for 3 months. They erected their own jails, conducted their own trials, and executed their own sentences without interference from government officials. The committee's methods were methodical rather than chaotic. They issued formal summons, conducted interrogations, and maintained detailed records of their proceedings. When they decided Charles Cora, a gambler who killed a US Marshal, deserved death, thousands gathered to watch his execution. The rope snapped his neck within view of the very courthouse where he should have faced trial. Montana Territory witnessed the most systematic campaign of vigilante justice in Western history when Sheriff Henry Plummer's double life was exposed in 1863. By day, Plummer enforced law and order in Bannock and Virginia City. By night, he led a gang of road agents who robbed gold shipments and murdered travelers along remote mountain passes. His gang operated with impunity because the sheriff himself provided information about valuable cargo and safe travel routes. When suspicious citizens finally connected Plummer to the string of robberies and murders, they formed their own secret organization. The Montana Vigilantes moved with deadly precision through the winter of 1863 and 1864. They hunted down gang members in remote cabins, mining camps and saloons across hundreds of miles of frozen wilderness. Each capture followed the same pattern: a brief interrogation, a hastily constructed gallows, and a body left swinging as a warning to others. The vigilantes developed their own calling card during this campaign. They would post wooden signs bearing the cryptic numbers 3777 near their execution sites. The meaning remains debated, but most historians believe it represented the dimensions of a grave: 3 feet wide, 7 feet long, and 77 inches deep. These markers served as territorial warnings that certain areas remained under vigilante control. Plummer himself met his end on a gallows he had reportedly used for official executions. When the vigilantes cornered him in Bannock, the sheriff who had sent innocent men to their deaths found himself facing the same rough justice. His final moments were spent pleading for a proper trial, while standing beneath the very rope he had used to hang others. The irony was not lost on the crowd that gathered to watch Montana's most corrupt lawman receive his due. The vigilantes eliminated 21 members of Plummer's gang in 6 weeks. Bodies swung from makeshift gallows in Virginia City, Helena, and remote mountain settlements. Each execution was carried out with mechanical efficiency, as if the vigilantes were clearing predators from livestock ranges. No appeals were heard, no stays of execution granted, and no mercy shown to men who had shown none to their victims. Public participation became a defining characteristic of frontier lynchings. Entire communities would cease their daily activities to witness executions. Children were brought to observe the consequences of criminal behaviour. Shopkeepers closed their stores, miners abandoned their claims, and ranchers rode in from distant spreads to attend these grim spectacles. The hanging served as both entertainment and education for populations starved of both. The efficiency of rope justice appealed to frontier communities facing immediate threats. A lynching could be organised, carried out, and concluded within hours of capturing a suspect. No waiting for circuit judges who might not arrive for months. No expensive trials requiring witnesses, lawyers, and juries. No risk of criminals escaping from makeshift jails or corrupt officials accepting bribes. The rope provided permanent solutions to immediate problems. Vigilante committees justified their actions through necessity rather than bloodlust. They argued that traditional legal processes were inadequate for frontier conditions, where survival depended on swift action against threats. When horse thieves could cripple a ranch's operations, when road agents could bankrupt entire communities, and when murderers could escape into vast wilderness areas, immediate punishment became a matter of communal survival. The psychological impact of lynching extended far beyond the individuals executed. Word of vigilante justice spread quickly through frontier networks of traders, prospectors, and travellers. The knowledge that certain communities would respond to crime with immediate death sentences served as a powerful deterrent to potential criminals. The rope became a symbol of frontier resolve, a promise that lawlessness would be met with lethal force, regardless of official legal procedures. This system of crowd justice flourished in the absence of established institutions, but withered as territorial governments gained strength and federal oversight increased. The rope that had served as arbiter of frontier justice eventually gave way to formal courtrooms, professional law enforcement, and standardized legal procedures. Yet for decades, the shadow of the noose hung over the American West as both threat and promise. Branding, the practice of marking human flesh with hot iron, transformed cattle ranching techniques into instruments of permanent punishment. Frontier communities borrowed directly from livestock management, applying the same branding irons used on cattle to criminals they deemed unworthy of death but deserving of lifelong shame. The scorching metal served as both punishment and warning, creating walking advertisements of frontier justice that could never be hidden or forgotten. Different territories developed their own symbolic vocabulary of brands. The letter T, seared into a forehead, marked a thief for life. M designated murderers who had somehow escaped the gallows. H branded horse thieves, while R identified robbers. These simple letters became scarlet marks more damaging than any prison sentence, as they rendered their bearers unemployable, unmarriageable, and unwelcome in civilized society. The tools of human branding differed little from those used in cattle operations. Iron letters were heated in campfires, or forged coals until they glowed cherry red. The brands were designed to burn deep enough to destroy skin tissue permanently, while avoiding damage to underlying bone or vital areas. Forehead and cheek locations were preferred because they remained visible regardless of clothing or seasonal changes. Thomas Blackjack Ketchum's associate, Harvey Logan, witnessed one of the most methodical brandings in frontier history during the winter of 1899. A captured gang member, known only as Mexican Pete, had been taken by ranchers near Folsom, New Mexico, after stealing horses from 3 different spreads. Rather than waste ammunition on an execution, the ranchers decided to create a living warning to other potential thieves. They heated an iron T in their campfire while Pete watched in growing horror. The ranchers debated placement as if discussing where to mark a prize bull. One argued for the forehead to ensure maximum visibility. Another preferred the cheek to allow the man some chance at concealing his shame. They settled on the forehead, reasoning that a horse thief should be immediately recognizable to anyone conducting business. When the iron reached proper temperature, glowing like a sunset, 4 men held Pete immobile while a 5th pressed the brand against his flesh. The smell of burning skin, mixed with Pete's screams, echoed across the high desert. The iron hissed and sizzled for 10 seconds before being removed, leaving behind a perfect T that would mark him as a thief for the remainder of his days. The psychological impact of branding often proved more devastating than the physical pain. Branded criminals became social outcasts, unable to find honest work or establish normal relationships. Employers would not hire workers bearing thieves' marks. Merchants refused service to branded customers. Even prostitutes often rejected clients whose faces bore evidence of criminal behaviour. The permanent nature of brands served multiple purposes for frontier communities. Unlike imprisonment, which eventually ended, or execution, which removed the criminal entirely, branding created living examples of frontier justice. Branded individuals became walking testimonials to the consequences of criminal behaviour, visible reminders that crime carried permanent costs in frontier society. Some branded criminals attempted to hide their marks through various means. They grew long hair or beards to conceal facial brands. Others wore hats pulled low over their foreheads, or adopted clothing that covered branded areas. The most desperate resorted to crude surgical attempts to remove the marks, often resulting in hideous scarring that proved even more conspicuous than the original brands. The process of branding typically occurred immediately after capture, while emotions ran high and the community's sense of violation remained fresh. Unlike formal trials that allowed time for reflection and due process, branding was administered in the heat of frontier anger. The immediacy served both to satisfy community outrage and to demonstrate swift consequences for criminal behaviour. Medical complications from branding often proved as severe as the social consequences. Infection frequently set in around the burned areas, particularly in frontier conditions where proper medical care remained unavailable. Some victims developed severe scarring that extended far beyond the original brand mark. Others suffered permanent nerve damage that left portions of their faces numb or paralysed. The tools required for human branding were readily available in frontier communities dependent on cattle ranching. Every ranch possessed branding irons and the knowledge necessary to heat and apply them effectively. This accessibility made branding an attractive punishment option for communities lacking formal jails, courthouses, or professional law enforcement personnel. Branded criminals often found themselves driven from territory to territory as their reputations preceded them. A thief marked in Colorado would discover that his brand was recognized and understood in Wyoming, Arizona, and New Mexico. The standardized nature of brand symbols created an informal communication system among frontier communities, allowing them to share information about undesirable individuals without formal record keeping. The effectiveness of branding as a deterrent lay partly in its public nature. Unlike imprisonment, which removed criminals from public view, branding ensured that punishment remained visible to everyone the criminal encountered thereafter. This constant reminder served to reinforce community standards while providing ongoing deterrent effects to potential criminals who could observe the lasting consequences of criminal behaviour. As territorial governments gained strength and formal legal systems developed, human branding gradually disappeared from frontier justice. The practice became viewed as barbaric and excessive, replaced by more standardised forms of punishment. Yet for decades, branded men and women continued to bear the physical evidence of frontier justice, living reminders of an era when communities took permanent vengeance against those who threatened their survival. Whipping, the crack of leather against human flesh, echoed through frontier town squares as communities adapted military and maritime punishment traditions to civilian justice. Whipping posts became permanent fixtures in settlements across the West, constructed from sturdy timber and positioned for maximum public visibility. The cat-o'-nine tails, with its multiple leather strands designed to maximize pain and tissue damage, found new purpose in territorial justice systems that valued swift punishment over lengthy imprisonment. Public floggings served as theatrical displays of community authority, drawing crowds that included entire families who viewed the spectacle as both entertainment and moral instruction. Town squares would fill with spectators whenever word spread that a whipping was scheduled. Merchants would close their shops, children would be excused from school, and ranchers would ride in from distant spreads to witness justice being administered with leather and pain. Body, California, earned a reputation for systematic brutality in its application of corporal punishment during the 1870s and 1880s. The mining boom town constructed an elaborate whipping post in its central square, complete with iron shackles and a raised platform that ensured optimal viewing for assembled crowds. Town records meticulously documented the number of lashes prescribed for different offences, creating a precise scale of suffering designed to match the severity of various crimes. The case of Margaret O'Sullivan demonstrated Bodie's commitment to equal punishment, regardless of gender. When the Irish immigrant was caught in an adulterous affair with a married minor in 1878, the town council sentenced her to 39 lashes to be administered publicly. The number was carefully chosen, as 40 lashes were considered potentially fatal, while 39 delivered maximum punishment while preserving life. O'Sullivan was dragged to the whipping post on a Tuesday morning as church bells rang across the valley. Her dress was cut away to expose her back, and leather restraints secured her wrists to prevent movement during the punishment. The The town's blacksmith, chosen for his powerful arms and steady temperament, wielded a cat-o'-nine-tails crafted specifically for human punishment. Each strand was knotted at regular intervals to ensure maximum tissue damage with every stroke. The first lash drew blood immediately, opening 9 parallel cuts across O'Sullivan's shoulders. Her screams carried across the silent crowd as the blacksmith methodically delivered stroke after stroke. By the 10th lash, her back had become a canvas of torn flesh and flowing blood. Spectators in the front rows were splattered with droplets that flew from the whip with each impact. Children pressed closer to their parents, while maintaining fascination with the gruesome display. The punishment continued with mechanical precision. Each lash was counted aloud by the town clerk, ensuring the prescribed sentence was fulfilled exactly. O'Sullivan's screams gradually weakened to whimpers, then to silence as shock overcame her capacity for vocalization. Blood pooled at the base of the whipping post, soaking into the wooden platform that had absorbed the suffering of dozens of previous victims. When the 39th lash finally fell, O'Sullivan hung unconscious in her restraints, her back transformed into ribbons of torn flesh. The town doctor examined her pulse and declared her alive but critical. She was cut down and carried to a makeshift medical facility, where her survival remained uncertain for weeks. Infection set in almost immediately, as frontier medical knowledge proved inadequate for treating extensive whipping injuries. Male offenders received similar treatment with adjustments for their presumed greater physical resilience. A cattle rustler named James Mackenzie received 50 lashes in Bodie Square after being caught with stolen livestock. His punishment was administered over 2 days to prevent death from shock, with 25 lashes delivered each morning, while crowds gathered to observe his progressive deterioration. The tools of frontier whipping were crafted with deliberate precision to maximise suffering, while minimising the risk of accidental death. Cat-o'-nine-tails were constructed with varying numbers of strands depending on the severity of punishment prescribed. Leather straps were treated with salt water to increase their cutting effectiveness. Wooden handles were carved to provide optimal grip for the individuals tasked with administering punishment. Medical consequences of frontier whipping often proved more severe than the immediate punishment. Infection was nearly universal in environments lacking proper antiseptic treatment. Permanent scarring created lifelong reminders of frontier justice that marked survivors as surely as hot iron brands. Nerve damage frequently left victims with limited mobility in their arms and shoulders, effectively crippling them for physical labour. The psychological impact extended beyond the individual being punished to encompass entire communities. Children who witnessed public floggings carried traumatic memories throughout their lives. Adults became desensitized to violence and suffering through repeated exposure to sanctioned brutality. The normalization of extreme physical punishment created cultures where violence became an acceptable solution to social problems. Frontier whipping differed from its military and maritime origins in its explicitly public nature. While ships and military units administered floggings to maintain discipline within contained populations, frontier communities used public whipping as broader social control mechanisms. The visibility was essential to the punishment's effectiveness as a deterrent to potential criminals and as a demonstration of community values. The expertise required for effective whipping led to the emergence of specialized individuals who administered punishment professionally. These men, often blacksmiths or butchers accustomed to physical exertion and blood, developed reputations for their ability to deliver prescribed punishments with proper intensity. Their skills were valued by communities seeking to ensure that sentences were carried out effectively, without accidental deaths that might provoke territorial government intervention. As territories evolved into states with formal judicial systems, public whipping gradually disappeared from frontier justice. The practice became viewed as barbaric and incompatible with civilized society. Yet the scars remained both on the bodies of survivors and in the collective memory of communities that had once gathered eagerly to watch leather tear human flesh in the name of justice. Exile. Banishment transformed the vast American wilderness into an instrument of slow death, as frontier communities discovered that forced exile often proved more cruel than immediate execution. The practice required no rope, no hot iron, no whipping post, only the terrible emptiness of hostile territory, where survival depended on resources, knowledge and luck that most exiled individuals lacked. Communities wielding exile as punishment understood that they were condemning criminals to face starvation, exposure, and predators in landscapes that showed no mercy to the unprepared. Sundown towns perfected the art of civilized banishment by establishing invisible boundaries that certain individuals could not cross after dark. These communities would deliver ultimatums with clockwork precision: leave by sunset or face immediate death. The message was always clear, always final, and always backed by enough armed citizens to ensure compliance. No appeals were heard, no extensions granted, and no mercy shown to those who tested the community's resolve. 24-hour departure orders became the standard time frame for exile sentences across the frontier. This brief window allowed condemned individuals enough time to gather minimal possessions while preventing them from organising resistance or revenge against their accusers. The tight deadline also served psychological purposes, creating panic and desperation that ensured swift compliance with banishment orders. Wild Bill Hickok experienced the peculiar torture of repeated exile throughout his career as a gunfighter and peace officer. Despite his reputation and skills, multiple communities found his presence too dangerous for their long-term survival. Abilene, Kansas, delivered him a sundown ultimatum in 1871 after he accidentally killed a deputy during a street confrontation. The town council, despite acknowledging his effectiveness in maintaining order, decided that his continued presence created more problems than it solved. Hickok received his banishment notice on a Tuesday afternoon while sitting in a saloon nursing whiskey and contemplating his uncertain future. The message was delivered by a nervous clerk who avoided eye contact while reading the formal declaration. Wild Bill had until sundown to gather his possessions and leave Abilene permanently. Return would be met with immediate execution by any citizen who recognized him. The legendary gunfighter found himself in the surreal position of packing his belongings while the very people he had protected watched from doorways and windows. His reputation, which had made him valuable as a peace officer, now made him too dangerous to tolerate. The irony was not lost on Hickok, who understood that his exile resulted not from criminal behaviour, but from his effectiveness at violence. As sunset approached, Hickok mounted his horse and rode slowly down the main street of Abilene for the final time. Citizens emerged from buildings to watch his departure, some grateful for his past service, others relieved to see him gone. Children peered around their parents' legs to catch a glimpse of the famous gunman being driven from their town like a common criminal. The psychological impact of exile often proved more devastating than its physical hardships. Banished individuals faced not only the immediate challenge of survival in hostile wilderness, but also the crushing knowledge that they had been rejected by human society. This social death sentence carried implications that extended far beyond the originating community, as word of banishment travelled quickly through frontier networks. Survival in exile required skills that many frontier criminals lacked. Knowledge of edible plants, water sources, shelter construction, and weather patterns became matters of life and death for individuals thrust into unfamiliar wilderness areas. Those banished during winter months faced almost certain death from exposure, while summer exiles confronted the challenges of finding water in arid landscapes. Economic consequences of banishment compounded the physical dangers. Exiled individuals lost access to employment, trade relationships, and financial resources that made frontier survival possible. They could not purchase supplies, hire guides, or secure transportation to more hospitable territories. This economic isolation often proved as lethal as any physical hardship the wilderness might impose. Tracking and enforcement mechanisms ensured that banishment orders were respected. Communities would post lookouts on major trails leading back to town, ready to kill any exiled individual who attempted to return. Neighbouring settlements would be warned about banished criminals, creating networks of exclusion that expanded the effective range of exile sentences far beyond the originating community. Some exiled individuals attempted to establish new lives in distant territories where their reputations had not preceded them. Success required travelling hundreds of miles through dangerous country, while avoiding both natural hazards and human threats. The few who managed this feat often discovered that frontier communication networks eventually carried news of their past, forcing them to move repeatedly as their histories caught up with them. The wilderness itself served as an impartial executioner for those unable to adapt to exile conditions. Mountain winters killed the unprepared with temperatures that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes. Desert summers claimed victims through dehydration and heat exposure. Wild animals, from wolves to bears to rattlesnakes, posed constant threats to individuals lacking proper weapons or defensive knowledge. Posses would sometimes track exiled individuals to ensure they continued moving away from the community rather than lingering in the surrounding area. These enforcement expeditions carried orders to kill on sight any banished criminal found within a prescribed distance of the town. The invisible boundaries of exile were enforced as vigorously as any physical barrier. The effectiveness of exile as both punishment and deterrent lay in its combination of immediate mercy and eventual cruelty. Communities could feel virtuous about sparing criminals' lives, while knowing that banishment often resulted in slower, more agonizing deaths than immediate execution would have provided. This psychological distance allowed frontier societies to maintain their self-image as civilized while administering punishments that were anything but merciful. Exile represented the ultimate expression of frontier pragmatism, removing unwanted individuals without the community resources required for imprisonment or the moral complications of public execution. The vast wilderness became both judge and executioner, delivering final sentences with the patient inevitability of starvation, exposure, and isolation. Torture. The merciless landscape of the American West provided natural instruments of agony that frontier communities exploited with calculated cruelty. Desert heat, mountain cold, and isolation became tools of interrogation and punishment that required no specialized equipment or expertise. Communities discovered that the environment itself could break human will more effectively than any device crafted by human hands, transforming the vast wilderness into a torture chamber where survival depended entirely on the mercy of captors. Water torture adapted perfectly to arid territories where liquid meant the difference between life and death. Captors would position prisoners within sight of water sources while denying them access, creating psychological torment that accompanied physical dehydration. The sound of flowing streams or the sight of full canteens became instruments of mental torture, as severe as any physical abuse. Staking prisoners under the desert sun represented the most systematic use of environmental torture. Victims would be spread eagle on the ground, with leather restraints securing their limbs to wooden stakes driven deep into hardpan soil. The positioning ensured maximum exposure to solar radiation, while preventing any movement that might provide relief from the relentless heat. This method required no guards, no ongoing supervision, and no expensive equipment, only patience as the sun slowly destroyed human flesh and sanity. The case of Apache Kid's capture in 1887 demonstrated military adoption of frontier torture techniques when traditional interrogation methods proved insufficient. The notorious Apache warrior had evaded cavalry units for months across the Arizona Territory, conducting raids that terrorized settlers and frustrated military commanders desperate for information about his hideouts and future plans. When Apache Kid was finally captured near Fort Apache, he maintained absolute silence during standard interrogation sessions. Military officers, under pressure from territorial authorities to extract actionable intelligence, decided that extraordinary circumstances justified extraordinary measures. They ordered the prisoner chained to wagon wheels in the military compound's central courtyard, positioned to receive full desert sun throughout the day. The first morning, Apache Kid maintained his stoic demeanor as temperatures climbed toward 100 degrees. His captors positioned themselves in nearby shade, occasionally offering water that was refused with silent contempt. By midday, when the metal wagon wheels became too hot to touch, the prisoner's skin began showing signs of severe burning, where it contacted the superheated iron. Officers documented their prisoner's progressive deterioration with clinical precision. His breathing became laboured as dehydration set in, his skin turned bright red, then began blistering where metal contacted flesh. By the third day, Apache Kid's silence had given way to incoherent muttering as heat exhaustion affected his mental faculties. Still, he revealed no information about Apache hideouts or planned attacks. The torture continued for 6 days as military personnel rotated shifts to observe their prisoner around the clock. Apache Kid's physical condition deteriorated rapidly under the relentless solar assault. His lips cracked and bled from dehydration. His skin peeled away in sheets where it had been burned by contact with metal. Flies gathered around his festering wounds, adding the torment of constant insect attack to his other sufferings. Psychological isolation accompanied physical torture as an equally devastating weapon. Prisoners subjected to extended torture were often placed in solitary confinement where they could contemplate their suffering without human contact or communication. This mental torture proved especially effective against individuals accustomed to community life, as the absence of social interaction created additional stress that compounded physical pain. Mutilation practices supplemented environmental torture when communities sought permanent rather than temporary punishment. Ear cropping, finger removal, and facial disfigurement served both as interrogation techniques and as permanent markers of criminal behaviour. These procedures were typically performed without medical knowledge or pain relief, using crude tools that maximise suffering while minimising the risk of accidental death. The removal of fingers represented particularly cruel and practical punishment for criminals whose offences involved manual dexterity. Horse thieves, card cheats, and pickpockets would have specific fingers severed to prevent them from practicing their criminal trades effectively. The amputation was usually performed with farming tools or knives heated in campfires, cauterizing wounds while creating maximum pain. Communities justified torture through the argument that extreme criminals deserved extreme punishment, particularly when their crimes threatened community survival. Horse thieves who could cripple transportation, spies who could expose defensive positions, and raiders who could guide future attacks were viewed as existential threats, requiring extraordinary measures to neutralize completely. The effectiveness of torture as an interrogation tool remained questionable, as many victims would say anything to end their suffering regardless of truth or accuracy. However, frontier communities often cared more about demonstrating their resolve than about extracting reliable information. Public displays of torture served as warnings to potential criminals that capture meant unimaginable suffering rather than quick death. Death rates from frontier torture were deliberately kept below 100% to maintain the practice's deterrent value. Communities wanted survivors who could spread word about the consequences of criminal behaviour, creating living testimonials to frontier justice that would discourage future offences. These scarred and broken survivors became walking advertisements for community resolve. Temperature extremes provided ready-made torture implements across different regions and seasons. Winter exposure could freeze flesh as effectively as summer heat could burn it. Mountain communities would chain prisoners to exposed rocks during blizzards, while desert settlements used solar radiation as their preferred instrument of agony. The consistent availability of environmental torture made it attractive to communities lacking resources for more elaborate punishment methods. As territorial governments established formal judicial procedures, torture gradually disappeared from frontier justice systems. The practice became viewed as barbaric and counterproductive, replaced by standardized punishment methods that met emerging standards of civilized behavior. Yet for decades, the American West had operated under principles where survival justified any means necessary to protect community interests, including the systematic destruction of human bodies and minds through calculated application of environmental cruelty.